Welcome to part one of this 5-part series. I look to introduce you to some of the fundamental motivations for studying media content, especially in relationship to culture. I will discuss the rise of mass society and mass culture, as well as semiotics, the study of signs and symbols. Also, we will talk a little bit about how we make sense of the meaning of the symbols and the signs that we engage. Lastly, we'll talk about Stuart Hall's model of encoding and decoding and its relevance to media content and the meaning that we walk away with when we engage media content. So, why this interest to study media? Well, fundamentally, when you think about it, media is everywhere. At one point, the idea that media saturated our lives and that media was everywhere was at the basis of like TVs being in every household, or maybe even households having more than one TV in them. But here we are in the 21st century, and we literally walk around with media technologies in our pocket. We wear them on our arms in the forms of smartwatches. All the more reason of why many scholars and theorists are interested in understanding how these technologies and content basically impact our ways of living and experiencing life. So if we go back to the earlier existence of where the development of mass communication, we appreciate that late 19th century going into the early 20th century, the world is shifting and changing on a massive scale. New technologies are changing the production industries, the farming industry, and of course, the communication industries. And with these new changes and transitions are developing new ways of living and experiencing the world. And with so many changes taking place in communication technologies, some theorists and scholars began to have questions, and fundamentally, two of those very basic questions began to revolve around the idea of political propaganda, as well as the concept of media's impact on culture and our values and beliefs. So, if we understand or appreciate that these theorists and scholars wanted to explore media technologies and media content were shifting our ways of thinking and ways of living, the two fundamental questions that often would be at the premise of any potential theory or scholarly development focused on how do we get to the point where the public, we as the masses, were able to have our hearts and minds manipulated by mediated propaganda, by political messaging, and the demonstration of certain content. We also have to explore and wonder, how did we get to a point where the new powerful means of mass communication, and at this point that would be technologies like radio, film, newspapers and magazines had a stronger presence in our lives and experiences at that point. How did these mass communication technologies become polluted, as some of these theorists and scholars would suggest, with mindless mass culture? And so the answer for a number of these theorists and these scholars at the time and developing throughout the 20th century was the transition that we made from rural communities to urban mass societies. Theorists and scholars like Ferdinand Tonis, who coined the term Mineshaft and Gesellschaft, suggested that in this understanding of Gemeinschaft, we lived in rural communities, and these rural communities were socially stable places for us. They had traditional values and authority figures that we respected and we looked up to, and that would often guide us to lead a right and moral life. And in doing so, we had strong connections not only within the family, but with other social institutions in these communities, creating this sense of stability. But no longer did we have this Gemeinschaft, this rural community, when we started to migrate away from the rural communities where we could no longer take care of ourselves and our family, and they moved to the urban city because they heard that there were opportunities. But in these migrations to these urban masses, this Gesellschaft, we became these atomized individuals that no longer had these strong social ties with one another. And instead, we were just individuals floating around in these urban areas with no true connection to one another. So instead, we became these isolated individuals who were cut off from one another and just consuming media on a mass base through radio and through film. So no longer are we experiencing this folk culture form of media, in which it's organic and participatory. Because when we're in this Mineshaft, these rural communities, our form of entertainment and information are coming from the very people that we engage. So for entertainment, we've had a long day of doing whatever work we do. We've had our dinner, but before we want to go to bed, we want to have some form of laughter or engagement. And so what happens? Maybe dad or mom goes to the piano or picks up the fiddle or the banjo or something and starts playing, and the kids start to sing the favorite song and dance to it. Or maybe grandma or grandpa or whomever the storyteller in the family or the community is gathers everybody around to tell that one story that people love to hear, and the kids are chiming in about what the hero did or how they escaped that situation or whatever it may be. But there's opportunity for engagement at that level of entertainment and information gathering, because we're probably getting information from our neighbors or somebody else in our local community to get a sense of what's going on. But no longer does that take place when we go to this Giselle shaft and these urban masses. Instead, we're having it given to us through these mass communicative devices. So as we are receiving this new content, this new information, we are getting these messages through carriers. And this walks us into the idea of semiotics, the study of signs. Theorists like Saussure suggest to us that we experience the world through these symbols and make sense of the world through symbols. And so when we engage in the world, we are engaging with objects, with images, with words, heck, even sounds that offer us some form of meaning. So you see this picture here is a picture of a bouquet of roses. And you think, well, it's a physical object. It is a bunch of flowers. But these flowers potentially communicate some form of meaning to us. And so when we get into semiotics, we understand that a sign, a symbol, is a combination of two particular things, a signifier and a signified. The signified, this abstract concept that we have some sort of emotion, some sort of thought, and we wish that we want to, and we want to share it with others. And so to be able to share that, we need a carrier. We need a signifier. So that carrier is going to be some sort of word, whether that is a verbal word or a written down word. It's maybe an image or some form of an object. For instance, the flowers from the last slide. So you have the sign, which is the combination of these two things, the signified, which is the abstract concept, and the signifier, which is the carrier of meaning. And so let's say the abstract concept is the idea of love or passion. I love you. I want you to know that I love you. Well, how do I get you to know that I love you? I have to have a carrier. I have to have something that conveys this sense of love. And with that, I write it down on a piece of paper, the words, I love you. I hand you a bouquet of flowers. This demonstrates that I love you. And perhaps I make a sound. I go, ooh, wee. And just because you hear me make that sound, perhaps it suggests to you or demonstrates to you, I have a sincere passion for you, that I love you. It becomes the carrier of my meaning. Signifiers are the meanings, and the signifieds must be associated with some sort of physical carrier, a signifier, in order for us to be able to convey our thoughts from one person to another. Now, there are two important things for us to keep in mind when we think about this combination of signified and signifier equaling symbol. One, you cannot communicate an abstract concept without some form of physical carrier. It is impossible. You need an image, you need a sound, you need some form of object or thing to convey the concept. Second, the relationship between the signifier and the signified is completely arbitrary. There is nothing that automatically makes a bouquet of red roses a symbol of love. There's nothing inherent about the roses that requires us to make an association with the concept of love or passion. Well, then the question becomes, well, how did he or she get what I meant? How does the other person understand what I'm conveying, this concept? How do they make sense of it? Well, the answer is that she or he understands this because that person shares the same cultural codes and conventions that you do. The codes and conventions tell us both that there is a particular association between the signifier and the signified that conveys a particular meaning. And actually, a demonstration of this, a little bit of a spoiler alert, in the film Aquaman. There is a scene in which Aquaman brings an Atlantean up to the surface level, and this Atlantean is engaging with the local community in the town and is experiencing all these things for the first time. And in one of the engagements or the interactions that she has with someone, I can't remember if it's Aquaman himself or somebody else that's in the town, but someone hands her a bouquet of flowers. She instead starts to eat the flowers. And of course, that makes for a comical scene because it's like, you don't eat flowers, but you know that. I know that. The person that gave her the flowers knew that. But her cultural code and convention did not recognize that the flowers meant something different than other than being edible or potentially something to feast on and eat. So, because she did not share the same cultural codes and conventions with the person that gave her the flowers, she did not receive the same meaning that was initiated to initially communicate. So, why do we talk about this idea, the study of semiotics in relationship with cultural studies and in relationship to media? Well, it is our job as the audience to determine how media text link up signifiers. So, when we're engaging with media content, the images, the forms of language, the words that are being spoken, the sounds that are being conveyed communicate some form of meaning. The construction of this content, the way that they are all put together, convey something for us to walk away with and understand. So, from a cultural studies perspective, textually, semiotic analysis helps us to better understand the meanings. And when these authors, these producers, these writers put together all of these signifiers, they're making usually conscious selections and sometimes unconscious selections about what these carriers are and potentially the implicit meanings embedded in them. So, combining these particular signifiers, the words and images and narratives construct certain meanings for us, the audience. So, then we have to ask ourselves, how is the text and others like it encouraging us to think about ourselves and the society in which we live? But we have to appreciate that when we engage with a symbol, when we engage with a signifier, that there are two levels of meaning for that signifier. On one level, there's the denotative meaning, which is the surface level, the literal thing in and of itself. Someone gives you a flower, that thing is simply a flower. And then on another level, there's a connotative meaning, which is the cultural meaning, the implicit suggestion that helps us to understand something from a cultural perspective. And it is this that is part of that codes and convention that I spoke about just a moment ago that carries us a little bit further in understanding the meanings in which the producers, the writers of content are looking to demonstrate to us. Which leads us to Stuart Hall's encoding and decoding model. Now, in this model, Hall suggests to us that producers of content arrange signifiers, carriers of meaning, to communicate a particular meaning. And within this, they have an intended meaning that becomes what is known as the preferred meaning. So all of these things put together become the text. The text in and of itself may be the film, the news article, the sound recording, whatever it may be, but some form of media content that is transmitting a preferred meaning to us, the audience. And as the audience, we are actively interpreting the text, making sense of it, and in doing so, we're drawing from our own experiences to produce a particular reading of that text. And as such, we associate the signifiers with particular meanings and signifiers of our own understanding. And as we're making sense of this information, we have one of three readings that we can walk away with as we decode. One is the dominant reading, in which we as the audience decode the meaning and the text and all the signifiers right in line with what the producers intended. And so we walk away reproducing the preferred meaning of that text. Whereas with the oppositional reading, whereas we make sense of the signifiers and everything that's taking place and conveying some form of meaning, we totally reject the political meanings and the values associated with the signifiers and what the producer would have us to accept and acknowledge as the preferred reading. And then lastly, there's the negotiated reading, in which, as the audience members, there are some elements of the message that we can agree with, that jive with the way we see the world and our values and beliefs, but there are certain parts of the signifiers and the preferred meaning that we just can't accept and acknowledge. Now, as I think about these three potential readings, there was one particular commercial that came into mind, and it was the Kendall Jenner Pepsi Cola commercial from a few years back. And I remember there were some people that rejected completely what seemed to be the preferred meaning embedded in this commercial, and the preferred meaning seemed to be the idea that, hey, the world is crazy, especially in particular with the police being accused of using excessive force when subduing or apprehending potential suspects. And so there was a lot of backlash against police forces and agencies of authority. And so Pepsi's attempt to subdue some of that, or to kind of say, let's all work together, was to create this commercial in which you have this hodgepodge of different characters that seem to be in this Mardi Gras type of celebration and moment, and then all of a sudden they encounter and engage of the police force in the area standing right before them. And Kendall Jenner emerges with this Pepsi Cola and shares it with one of the police officers in this scene. And so the dominant preferred reading would be that, we need to be accepting and loving of one another. The world is a diverse and a variety of people, and we can all live harmoniously, and Pepsi's there to support that. But many people had an oppositional reading where they just rejected the concept of the world getting along in such a manner, and Pepsi being the lead and Kendall Jenner leading the way to all of this acceptance and this harmonious existence. Random potential negotiated reading is like, hey, I don't know about Kendall Jenner being the one to lead us to this harmonious place, but I could sure use a Pepsi. Sounds good right about now. With that said, I hope this was an interesting walk through the understanding of how we to some degree evolved into this mass culture, mass communication society, as well as how we began to engage and interact with the symbols and signs that we see transmitted to us through mass communication and make sense of it. With that being said, I look forward to sharing the next presentation with you, dealing with the power structures and the ability for media content to influence how we see ourselves and make sense of the world and others. But my challenge for you after this presentation is that as you now engage with media content, think about what are the preferred meanings, what are the implicit cultural meanings that are being expressed to you through these broadcasts, through these transmissions. What would the producers and the directors and the actors have you to walk away with the meanings? And then what are your readings of this? Do you have the dominant reading where you accept the preferred? Is your reading oppositional, or is it negotiated in some way, shape, or form? Thank you for taking your time and listening to this. I look forward to sharing the next information with you.